This man believes that God has spoken to him, but God doesn't tell the man to go out and help people or go and do good deeds in his name. Instead, God tells him that heaven needs sacrifices, human sacrifices. Today's story is about religious psychosis taken to really extreme conclusions. It's about a man whose obsession and conviction killed 5 people and psychologically wounded dozens more. Before we get into the video, I want to give you guys a bit of a content warning as this case today is quite brutal and graphic. There is mentions of necrophilia as well as cannibalism. So if those are things that are difficult for you, please take the time to take care of yourself and your mental health. But otherwise, let's get straight into it. When you think of a motel, what exactly comes to mind? Because for me, when I think of a motel, I think of that neon flickering sign, those small rooms that have those weird carpets and those weird patterns and a small bumpy bed. But it's mostly motels that I've seen in movies that portray them as places that are kind of in the middle of nowhere, like maybe in a desert, pretty isolated. And it usually feels like it's a place that people go to when they're running away from something, or if they just need to crash somewhere for a night after traveling for a long time. But a lot of movies that I watch, motels are usually places of conflict. Sometimes people go there for drug deals or to escape someone. Sometimes there's like fights that break out. But this is real life, and not everything is a movie, and it's not always that dramatic and intense. Sometimes motels really are just a place people go to crash for a night after driving for hours and hours on end. And it can also be a home for a lot of people, not just for a night, but sometimes for many nights, months, or even years. In the United States, there are around 800,000 Americans who are counted as homeless in early 2025. And sometimes these people will resort to staying in motels because they just lack other housing options. Many people can end up living there for a really long time, usually longer than they would have anticipated at first. Sometimes you use it as a short-term rental and then it ends up becoming your home. Now, in Euless, Texas, there is this motel there called the Mid-City Inn. And to give you an idea of what this motel looks like, well, it literally looks like any other motel that you could think of, like all the ones that you see in movies. It has these red and white bricks all over. It's really your standard looking motel, like small rooms side by side. You can probably hear the next person in the next room if they're like loud enough and if they're shuffling things around. And the rooms are pretty small, the bathrooms as well, and it's not exactly like the cleanest place, but it's good enough. I mean, it is what you would expect it to be for a low budget motel. Now, this sort of accommodation becomes a home for many, and some people come and go, but for a lot of people, they become regulars there and they end up living in that motel for a long while, and then they start becoming a part of this community. After some time, you get familiar with the person who's next door to you, you become friends with the motel owner. Now, for one man, David Lueres, he stayed at the Mid-City Inn for quite some time. He was quite integrated within the motel community there. And it was known that he had some personal issues. We don't know to what extent exactly, but he was in bad business with some bad people and he was quite paranoid and seeking help from someone. Like he just needed a friend, needed some comfort, a safe space, if you will. And luckily, he did have one person that he knew that was staying at the Mid-City Inn, and that was Jason Thornburg. David Lueres was just looking for a place to stay, and Jason offered him a room. And David was really thankful because he was quite paranoid and not in a good situation. He needed a place to crash. He was also one of those people similar to Jason who was really struggling with housing instability. So luckily, his friend Jason let him stay at the motel room with him for a couple of nights. And a few days later, David had sort of stopped responding to calls and texts. It had been some time since people had seen him. No one had heard from him. So people around the motel would go to Jason and ask him like, "Hey, have you seen David anywhere?" And Jason would just go, "No, I haven't seen or heard from him," which was a little weird because last we know, David was staying with Jason in his motel room. On September 22nd, 2021, really late at night, while everyone is asleep in their beds and there is no one out on the streets. This was in a residential suburban area in Fort Worth, and people were sleeping in their rooms when suddenly they could smell this burning. It almost smelled like burnt plastic, maybe mixed with garbage. It was quite a strong and gross smell. And it was also something else that they couldn't really recognize. And as they were laying in their beds and sniffing, what is that? What is that smell? They just see this glowing tint in their windows. Out of curiosity, you would probably get out from your bed and go over to the window to see what was happening, right? And they look over and they see a huge fire coming out of a dumpster. And I'm talking like a massive fire, not just like a little bit, it's huge. Now, at first, people are thinking, okay, that's pretty insane, but maybe it was a prank. Maybe some, annoying teenagers thought it would be funny to light the trash on fire. So that's what was happening. That was kind of the thought that a lot of people had. But of course, the first thing you should do when you see a fire is call 911. So that's what they did. And very quickly, first emergency responders arrived on scene. Now, there was a lot of commotion. People were coming out of their homes. Everyone wanted to see, what was going on, what caused this fire, why is this happening at like 3 o'clock in the morning while everyone was sleeping peacefully in their beds? Now, as they were taking out the fire, everything started to calm down a bit. Guys, it's okay, relax, everything is under control. Now, of course, because there was this huge fire incident, it could be definitely a safety hazard. There was also police officers there as well as firefighters. And as the flames settled and the smoke in the air started disappearing, they started to peer over into the dumpster to see what exactly was set on fire. Now, at first, it was kind of hard to distinguish what was there. It mostly just looked like trash, things that you wouldn't really care for. But when they looked closer, it almost looked like the shape of a body, almost. No, right? It's not a human body, like, surely not. But when they looked, it was a human body, a burnt human body, cut up into tiny little pieces. And when they looked even further, it wasn't just one body, it wasn't just two, it was three bodies. All of them dismembered, burnt to a crisp. And at first, it's almost shocking. You can't even tell, like, is this really a human body? And your mind is trying to come up with explanations like, surely it's not, it must be something else, but it was. And when they first saw this, they almost thought that it was maybe a teenager, possibly a child, because of how small the pieces were. And at this time, it was really too difficult to tell how many people exactly who they were. Were they an adult? Were they an elderly? Was it someone who was younger? They had no idea who these people were, but most importantly, they had no idea who did this. After they had seen the burnt corpses in the dumpster, the first course of action was to try and figure out if there was any surveillance footage in the surrounding area, to try and see could they possibly find out who did this. Was it maybe caught on camera? So the first thing they did was walk around the area, and they did find some footage that they were able to acquire from a nearby motel parking lot. And they took the time to go through this footage. They had to go through hours and hours until they find that perfect timing of when the fire started. And as they were watching this footage, they see this huge dark SUV pull up to the dumpster, and you can kind of see a figure of someone dumping contents into the dumpster, but you can't really distinguish who this person is or what they look like exactly. The only thing that they can really tell from this footage is the car. When they kept watching it, they were able to identify the car as a black Jeep Cherokee. Now, this is a pretty common car to have, but what stood out to the investigators was the fact that this car had chrome rims and a roof rack. So these were very specific and unique details to this car. The next thing they decided to do was to cross-reference this vehicle description against registration records. But of course, thousands of people own a black Jeep Cherokee. But the chrome rims, this unique attribute of the car, is literally what helped them identify the owner of the car. And they were able to match it back to an individual known as Jason Thornburg. And this was a man who was staying at the Mid-City Inn, the same man who was friends with David Luedes. Now, police began pretty much immediately looking into Jason now that they have this solid connection of him to this Jeep and him dumping stuff into the dumpster late at night. Like, it's all very obviously suspicious. suspicious. So after linking the Jeep to him and finding out that he was staying at the Mid-City Inn, investigators head over there and they were able to obtain motel surveillance footage of him that confirmed that he was staying there in room 113. Now, they have clear video evidence that's linking Jason Thornburg to the dumpster fire as well as his location at the motel. At this point, things moved pretty quickly, and this was enough evidence for them to obtain a search warrant. So they went over to the motel. They went up to room 113 where Jason was staying in. They knock on the door. Jason opens it and he's pretty much arrested on the spot. Because when investigators go into the room, they see so much evidence that's like really, really concerning and definitely incriminates Jason in a possible murder. They see blood all over the floor. They can also see that bodies were clearly dismembered by the bathroom area, specifically where the tub is, as there was almost a poor attempt to clean up all of this blood evidence. Like you can see a lot of remaining blood all over the place. They also found a knife, and this is going to be important later on, but they also found plastic containers and tubs, the same ones that they had found in the dumpster, all in Jason's room. So this was all very consistent to what they had seen in the surveillance footage. And he was immediately arrested on September 27th, 2021. So it only took them 5 days to find Jason and arrest him from the moment the dumpster fire happened to his arrest. So they moved really quickly throughout all of this. Now, who is Jason Thornburg? Why was he dumping contents into a dumpster late at night? Now, Jason Thornburg, he moved into the Mid-City Inn, that motel we were talking about earlier in Euless, Texas, in July 2021, and he stayed there for around 3 months. So he was one of those people that quite struggled with housing instability, so he used a motel as an option for long-term stay, and he also would move around quite a lot as well. The people at the motel described him as someone who is quite religious and Bible focused, and there's obviously nothing wrong with that at all. They just noted that he was quite intense about it. He was always preaching these things and always talking about his desire of wanting to help people and being on God's mission. He would also leave postcards for a local church in the motel office. But because he was someone that was staying at the hotel for quite some time, I think he was there for around 3 months, the staff kind of treated him as someone that was like allowed to get away with these things. So sometimes he would come up to people and like start talking to them about the Bible. And if people were like, hey, like I'm not interested, and he would persist, the staff there didn't really say or do anything about it because they were like, oh, well, he's staying at the motel for a while. So they kind of treated him as like a guest that could kind of get away and like do certain things. So at this point, he's like basically living out of the motel full time, and people just kind of clock him as someone who's really religious and intense. Jason Thornburg was born on August 27th, 1980 in Cerritos, California. He was a Native American man, and he did work as an electrician apprentice at the time of this case. But throughout his adult life, he was a little bit of a drifter. He didn't really have stable employment, and he kind of hopped between a lot of odd jobs. And he also moved around a lot. He went between California, Arizona, Texas. So that's why a motel was actually a great option for him to settle down. Not only did Jason move around a lot, but he actually had a record for evading arrest. And he did serve a 2-year sentence prior to this whole case, but then he was released in 2019. Now, when Jason was arrested on September 27th, after the investigators had identified him as the main suspect for the dumpster fire, when they brought him in for questioning, he said a lot of things, like a lot of wild ass things. He was talking a lot about the Bible and about his religion, and he was kind of just blabbering on about it. It had really nothing to do with the dumpster fire or the fact that they found dismembered body parts in the dumpster fire. He was essentially weaponizing his religion and using it as a justification for these killings. He said that he believed he was being called to commit human sacrifices. That was how he justified it. He said that it was God's will, he was on this mission, and it was just something that had to be done. So he killed 3 people, cut them up, and dumped their remains into the dumpster and set it on fire. He pretty much confessed to all of this pretty quickly. And from the get-go, it was pretty clear to the investigators that he was responsible for all of this. But He pretty much just claimed that he was a missionary. And if you don't know what a missionary is, it's essentially an individual who's usually sent by a religious group who travels around a country or a state to promote their faith or perform charitable work. And in his mind, he thought he was that person. He thought that he was out helping people, that this was something that he had to do, and that by committing these human sacrifices, he almost helped them in his weird, twisted way. I mean, it is incredibly ironic, but it's also just very concerning that that is how he justified it all in his head. Now, throughout his confession, he was weaponizing his religion and the Bible quite a lot to justify these horrific killings, but he also went on to confess as to how he did it and what exactly went down at the Mid City Inn, specifically in room 113. Now, he did clarify to investigators that he killed three adult people. At first, when they saw the bodies in the dumpster, it was very hard to distinguish a lot of factors because they were pretty much burnt to a crisp. And initially, they thought that potentially one of the victims could have been a younger person, but Jason confirmed that it was actually three adult people, people that he knew, people that he was friends with. And he went into really graphic detail as to how he killed them, how and why he dismembered their bodies, and his process of burning all of them. He basically didn't want to leave any evidence behind. He didn't want to have any fingerprints left behind. And not only that, it was kind of a way for him to erase their identities as well. Throughout his entire confession, he never once denied anything. He admitted to everything, clear as day. He didn't claim self defense. He didn't say that it was an accident or try to say, like, I think I'm a bit crazy or I'm suffering with mental illness. No, he was very, like, almost logical. And I say that lightly, like, logical in his explanations for these killings by saying it was necessary and using his religion as a justification. Now, when he went into describing the killings, he talked about his first victim, David Lueres, which was the same man we mentioned earlier. He was 46 years old. He was a quiet and friendly person, and he was well known around the motel community. He would hang out around there, but similar to Jason, he was struggling with housing instability, which is why he crashed with Jason for a couple of days. And he thought he was safe. He thought that Jason was a friend, and he thought Jason was someone that could be relied upon because he was always talking about and preaching, wanting to help people, and that he was a part of a church. So David thought, yeah, I'll stay with you. Thanks for taking me in. But one night, when David was crashing over at Jason's room, he made a makeshift bed on the floor with pillows and a blanket. And for his last night alive, he thought he was safe. And he was thankful that he had a friend. He had no idea what Jason was about to do to him. As he laid there sleeping, Jason hovered over his body and slit his throat, which pretty much killed David straight away in his sleep. He had no chance to fight back, no opportunity of a confrontation. It's almost like a cowardly thing to do. Like, Jason was not even able to confront what he was doing to David. After Jason slit his throat and David died, he took his body over to the bathroom, and there was a tub in his bathroom, so he placed the body in there and then proceeded to cut him up. And Jason is aware of the fact that he can't use a saw or heavy utility items to cut up a body because people in the motel would probably hear. The walls were thin, so he used a knife instead, the same knife that investigators first saw when they arrested Jason and first came into his room. And Jason also admitted to eating a part of David's heart. He believed that in some twisted way, this would be him like consuming his soul. Now, a couple of days after David's murder, which by the way, no one really knew what was happening in room 113. People weren't aware of the fact that David had pretty much just disappeared and he hadn't been heard from for a couple of days. No one had seen him. And throughout this time, Jason would play really loud gospel music from his room. Now, some sources say otherwise, like this isn't 100% confirmed. This is just based on what residents at the motel said that they had heard at the time, but this was highly due to the fact that Jason wanted to cover up what was going on in that room. So after he had killed David, another woman, his second victim, was Mary Cruz Mathis. She was 33 years old from Arizona, and unfortunately, sources don't provide too much information on her. But Jason told the investigators how the murder happened. She went to the Mid City Inn, she was visiting Jason, and headed inside of his room. Now, we are unsure as to what exactly she was doing there or as to why she headed into Jason's room. Some people online say that it had something to do with the fact that he was hosting Bible studies in his room because, again, he was quite religious and he was always preaching it. And she was also someone who was religious, and so that's why she was there to see Jason. Now, Jason said that he strangled and stabbed her, and then after killing her, the same that he did to David, brought her body over to the bathroom and decided to dismember her. He then put pieces of her body into plastic containers and plastic bags, the same items that he had thrown into the dumpster and set everything on fire. And he did the same thing to David's body parts as well. Now, all of this is also confirmed by the medical examiner, and the strangulation and sharp force injuries, like the stabbing that he used with a knife, is all consistent with the post-mortem forensic analysis. So after he did this, he essentially kept the remains inside of his room for a couple of days. Like, we have to keep in mind that he killed David. 2 days later, he killed Mary Cruz. And throughout this time, he never once left his room. So after he dismembered them, he put their body parts into containers and bags and kept it in the room. It wasn't like he was going in and out, back and forth to like throw it away into a dumpster. He did that all together at the end after 1 week of committing these horrific acts. Now, his third victim was Lauren Phillips, and this murder occurs roughly 2 days after Mary Cruz. Now, Lauren was 34 years old. She was a mother. She had 2 sons, and she lived in Dallas, Fort Worth. Now, prior to the dumpster fire and prior to Lauren's murder, she went missing, right? Because after she went into Jason's room, and again, sources don't confirm as to why she was there. It could have possibly been for a Bible study and she was misled. Her mother had a feeling that something was wrong, that her daughter was missing. So it's not really clear what happened to make her believe this so strongly, but Lauren's mother seemed to be the few people who were really aware of the fact that Jason was sus. Like, she knew from the get-go, like, oh, something is up with Jason. She did something to my daughter. She had this feeling. And I guess we could call it a mother's intuition. Now, I can't imagine being in a state like that, knowing that your daughter has been missing for a day or so, you haven't heard from them, but you just can't confirm or find out what exactly happened until you eventually hear about it on the news because there's this huge dumpster fire and her remains are found there. It's honestly just so horrible. Jason went on to describe the murder, and he confessed to strangling Lauren and then continued to dismember her body the same way he did to David and Mary Cruz. And then he violated her body. So this was the only instance of necrophilia. He did not violate the previous bodies, although he did eat their body parts, and that is definitely a violation in a lot of ways. At this point, Jason has not only killed 3 people, but he's also eaten the flesh of David's heart and eaten parts of Lauren's body as well. So it's really likely that he consumed their body parts as a part of this ritual sacrifice that he claimed was God's doing, right? And ritualistic cannibalism isn't that unheard of. In fact, some cultures have practiced it all the way through to the 20th century. Cannibalism was historically documented in Papua New Guinea, and they used to perform ritualistic cannibalism. They would essentially consume their deceased relatives as they thought that eating their loved ones was a way to honor them and to essentially absorb their spirit. They were quite spiritual and religious with this. It wasn't something that was done violently, it was very integrated within their culture. But this unfortunately led to the spread of a lot of diseases because, as you know, eating human meat is not good for you. And by the 1950s to 60s, entire villages were essentially affected by this disease called the Kuru disease. And this spread like crazy because a lot of people were participating in this ritualistic cannibalism, but outside intervention and education did occur. So they eventually stopped this practice and it is no longer ongoing. Now, Kru disease is a disease that occurs when you eat human meat. And kuru means to shake. And it's labeled that because you get these really intense tremors when you are diagnosed with this disease. And there's a lot of really concerning symptoms that happen. You have a loss of coordination, like it's difficult to walk, it's difficult to move and use your hands. You just like have uncontrollable shaking. And your mind also starts to deteriorate like pretty fast. And it's fatal. Death usually occurs within 1 year of symptom onset. Now, this is only just one example as to what can happen to you when you eat human meat. There's a ton of other biological effects that are really, really bad for you, obviously. And in modern criminal psychology, cannibalism is often associated with a list of diagnoses. Usually, it's done when someone has severe psychosis, they're not aware. Sometimes they're not aware of what they're doing, or they have difficulty distinguishing between what's real or not. It can also occur when there is delusional religious beliefs, like in this case, and ritualized violence. And cannibalism is really about hunger. As we know, it's usually about power, possession, wanting to absorb someone's essence. And in this specific case, Jason describes all of it as an essential human sacrifice that was strongly tied to his religious beliefs. Now, after Jason dismembered, violated, and ate parts of his victims' bodies, this is when he decided, like, okay, now that I'm done doing all of that crazy stuff, I need to get rid of the evidence. So, what am I going to do? This is when he decided to drive 30 miles away from the Motel Inn to the dumpster late at night and start dumping parts of the human remains into the trash. But this wasn't just like one trip that he did. He apparently went back and forth a couple of times, which also to me seems very inefficient and definitely probably contributed to him getting caught because it was all on camera nearby. But this is when he decided to set the bodies aflame to try and basically erase the evidence. Now, when he was describing all of this to investigators, it was a lot for them to process. They haven't had a case this brutal, this awful in their whole careers, really. And what really irked a lot of people about this case specifically was just how much Jason emphasized the fact that this was God's will, and he really used his religion as a justification for carrying out these human sacrifices. He believed that he was acting with divine instruction. But what's an important note is that as he was justifying all of this in his own weird, twisted way, investigators noted that this meant he was fully aware of his actions. He was not someone that was delusional or experiencing psychosis and wasn't able to distinguish between reality and what was just crazy. He knew what he was doing. It was all very intentional, very deliberate. We can tell from the way that he cut up the human bodies, put them into containers, and then set it into a trash and light it all on fire. Like that's all very clear and intentional. Like he knows what he was doing. He wanted to erase the evidence. But when he was caught, it was sort of like, okay, well, I might as well just admit everything because they already know that it was me. So he didn't shy away from the details whatsoever. The thing is, though, after he had confessed to killing 3 people at the motel, he actually confessed to 2 more killings that happened before this. A man named Mark Jewell in that same year of 2021, and another victim of his was Tanya Begay back in 2017, which was his ex girlfriend. So now this wasn't just a motel case, this was something that stretched across years, across state lines. He was essentially a serial killer in plain sight, and no one had any idea. Back in 2017, March, Jason was dating this woman named Tanya Begay, and she was 34 years old at the time. She was from Gallup, New Mexico, and she was described by her family as someone who's really caring, really spiritual, who is deeply connected to her community. And essentially, during that time, Jason and Tanya wanted to go on a little couples trip, a little getaway. But during this trip, she essentially vanished, disappeared off of the earth. No one knew where she was. And her family pretty much straight away reported her missing because obviously this is really concerning. What the heck? Where is our daughter? Where is my sister? And Jason was the primary suspect in this because he was the boyfriend. He was the last known person who was traveling with her. And he was brought in for questioning, but at the time, they had no body. Tanya disappeared. Like they didn't know where she was and they couldn't find a body if she was dead. Like at the time, this is what they were thinking. So unfortunately, there was no evidence tying Jason to Tanya's disappearance, and there's no evidence that there was a homicide. So no charges were filed and the case pretty much stalled and went cold. Now, from 2017 to 2021, up until the day he was arrested and confessed to this, Tanya's case remained unresolved. And throughout this time, Jason also drifted a lot between states. And he actually had previous arrests in his past, but he had no homicide charges. And it's just really sad because throughout this whole time, Tanya's family had no answers, no closure. They had no idea what happened to Tanya. And this wasn't just something that happened spontaneously. It wasn't like Jason killed these three people at the motel out of nowhere. He had already killed someone years prior. So he was a serial killer this whole time, but no one had any idea. They could have done something all the way back then. They could have looked harder. They could have pressed him more, but unfortunately, the investigation just went nowhere. Cases like this are so frustrating because not only did investigators at the time fail Tanya and fail Tanya's family, Jason had prior arrests. Like he had a record. The red flags were almost somewhat clear, and he did have domestic violence allegations against him because there was one time where him and Tanya were arguing and he had thrown allegedly a coffee pot at her face, which caused her to go to the hospital. So all of the red flags were there. And in a lot of cases that we cover in this channel, where women die at the hands of their partners, which unfortunately is like a really damning statistic when you take a look at it. Most of the time, when women are murdered, it's usually done by someone that they know, which is just insane. But nonetheless, there is a pattern of behavior. It's not usually something that just happens out of nowhere, out of the blue. There are usually clear signs and it's like a buildup over time. Perhaps they're controlling their partner, they're not letting them go out and hang out with people, they isolate them. And unfortunately, most women are most at risk of being killed when they try to leave their partner. So, in many intimate partner homicides, friends and family will later say that the red flags were there. And by no means am I trying to say that Tanya's family knew and they didn't step in and that they didn't do anything. That is not at all what I am saying. Just that it's really unfortunate in cases like this where there's a lot of clear concerning signs, but whether it's the FBI or investigators, whoever, they don't press hard enough. They don't look hard enough. And women like Tanya are left essentially with no answers and no closure. The only reason they even found out about any of this was because Jason confessed to it. Now, on top of that, Tanya was a Native American woman. And unfortunately, in the United States, like statistically, they're amongst the most vulnerable group of people. According to the National Institute of Justice, 4 in 5 Native American women, which is around 84%, by the way, experience violence in their lifetime. They face murder rates 10 times more than the national average. And a large percentage of these cases go unsolved. They go cold, like Tanya Begay. Many disappear and are never fully investigated. They don't get as much media coverage. And a lot of families oftentimes press for more investigation, press for more attention, but sometimes people just don't care. And a lot of advocacy groups have long argued that this is due to systemic neglect and racial bias that contribute to why so many Native American women cases go unresolved. So when Tanya disappeared, her family had no answers. They were left in a position far too familiar to many Native families, just waiting and hoping that one day they would maybe get some answers. Now, at least we can say that they were able to get closure in some sense since Jason admitted to these horrific crimes. But there was another victim after Tanya, his second killing. This was back in 2021. So it was actually in the same year that he committed the motel murders and when he got arrested, but it was earlier in the year in May. And Jason was living with this man named Mark Jewell. They were actually roommates. This was in Fort Worth, Texas. And Mark unfortunately died in a house fire. Now, at the time that this had happened, there was nothing that ruled it as a homicide. There was nothing suspicious about the case. It was just an unfortunate tragedy, an accident. But during Jason's interrogation, he confessed to killing Mark Jewell. It was very intentional. He was the one that planned the house fire. He told the investigators what happened, and he said that one night in May, while his friend, roommate, Mark, was sleeping, he went over to his room, and as he was laying there in his sleep, unsuspecting, unknowing that Jason was just there hovering, looking at him with a knife in his hands, the same exact way that he had killed David Luetis, he slit his throat. And then he uncapped a gas line inside the home, lit up a candle, and the whole house got set on fire. And this was intentional. The reason Jason decided to set the house on fire was to destroy all of the evidence. It seems like he has a pattern. He set the house on fire to erase evidence, and then he also tried to set another fire to essentially erase evidence of the motel murders. But only after his confession did authorities pursue formal charges related to Mark Jewell's death. And so his indictment for this case did happen later on in February 2022. After Jason's confession and after his arrest, he had to undergo psychiatric evaluation. This happened in October 2021, so not that far after he got arrested. And the court had to determine whether or not he was competent enough to stand trial. Is he just like a crazy ass person, or is he able to comprehend enough as to what's going on? Is he fit enough to stand trial? And they did find that he was competent enough to stand trial. 2 months after his psychiatric evaluation in December, he had his indictment process, which is essentially when someone is formally charged with a crime, and the Tarrant County grand jury indicted him on 3 counts of capital murder. So this means that the prosecutors were able to present enough evidence for the motel murders and say like, hey, this is what he did, this is all the evidence that we have for it. And the jury decided like, yeah, this is enough proof, let's carry it on to trial. There was a probable cause. So the case officially became a capital murder trial. The trial began in November 2024 in Tarrant County, Texas. And Jason's defense team, they raised a lot of issues in relation to mental health. Their whole stance wasn't to deny that he committed these murders, because he did confess to it and they just had too much evidence against him. Their whole position was to argue that he did not deserve the death penalty, because the prosecution was seeking the death penalty. And his whole defense was, no, he's not mentally well. He didn't really know what he was doing. Instead, let's push for him to be in prison for the rest of his life, essentially. And they did this by mentioning a possible fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, because they argued that Jason had a rough start in life because his mother drank while he was in the womb. And this obviously doesn't justify his violent crimes, but they try to use this as a defense to say that, look, because he had a rough start in life, this is enough to not sentence him to death. Let's sympathize with him. They also mentioned his long-standing psychiatric instability. They mentioned that Jason was on medication and was actively trying to get better mentally. And again, this was supposed to feed into the narrative that we have to basically try and find some sympathy towards him. Throughout the trial, the defense lawyer actually reads a passage from the Bible, and it's clear that they're using it as a way to weaponize it. And Texas, where the trial occurred, there's a lot of people there who are quite religious, who are Christian. So perhaps a lot of the jury could also be Christian. And the defense team was probably aware of this. So they read a passage from the Bible in hopes that maybe, again, you will sympathize with Jason or find something that's relatable about him. At some point in the trial as well, the defense team did say, and I quote, "Do we execute someone whose mother left them in a position where they are susceptible to all the evils in our society? Or do we take the other option and confine them for the remainder of their natural life?" Now, what do you guys think about this? Because a lot of comments online are shocked that the lawyer was weaponizing the Bible in a case like this, and that he had basically said, well, it's not Jason's fault for committing these murders because he had a rough start in life. His mother drank in the womb. When it's very clear that he is just an evil man. The defense also went on to say that the FBI conducted a really poor investigation on the previous two murders that Jason committed, and that it was on them that they didn't catch him earlier. So they were partially responsible for the fact that Jason was then able to go and kill 3 more people in the motel murders. So some people online seem to agree with this. And when I say agree with this, I mean they agree with the fact that Tanya Begay, for example, and Mark Jewell, both of them really, they didn't have any justice at the time. They had no closure for their cases. People didn't look well enough to figure out what actually happened to them. But that does not alleviate what he did. Jason Thornburg is responsible for those murders. His defense team tried their best to basically alleviate his blame, alleviate the responsibility. Let's not have him take accountability for his actions. Let's sympathize with him. That was essentially their stance. Now, the prosecution, they had a pretty strong case against Jason Thornburg. They were seeking the death penalty. They did not want him to be in prison for the rest of his life. And they had a lot to work with. Jason confessed to the murders, not just to the 3 motel murders, but to the 2 ones prior to that. They had a ton of forensic evidence from the motel room. They had the knife that was used to stab and kill his victims as well as dismember them. There were bloodstains all around his room. There was a surveillance footage of him driving his car that was linked to him late at night, dumping all of the body parts into the dumpster. I mean, they just had so much evidence. It's like irrefutable, right? And the prosecution basically argued that Jason was not impulsive. He does not have brain deficiencies. He had a 4.0 in community college. He was an electrician. His acts of violence were not done impulsively. He knew what he was doing. They were thought out, they were planned. And they also went on to say that Jason was only diagnosed with mild fetal alcohol syndrome. And even then, he has high executive functioning. He wasn't on the spectrum of fetal alcohol syndrome where he's not aware of what he's doing. He's high functioning, the prosecution says. So all of these claims that the defense had said earlier were quite weak. And the claims of mental illness was just nothing more than a defense, honestly. The district attorney said that Jason was evil and had a depraved indifference to life. They also went on to emphasize that if Jason were to be sent to life in prison, that is also a risk for those who work at the prison. Because before the trial, while Jason was awaiting trial and was in prison, he was apparently making makeshift weapons in his cell, like shivs and whatnot. And the prosecution emphasized this. They said, imagine if he had life in prison, with the amount of time he would have and what he could do with it. They highlighted the fact that he would be an ongoing threat. Just because you'd be life in prison doesn't mean that he can no longer hurt anyone. Other people working there could definitely be at risk. Therefore, the death sentence was needed. Now, it didn't take long for the jury to make a decision. They found him guilty on all 3 counts of capital murder. And on December 4th of 2024, the jury unanimously sentenced him to death. And Jason was then transferred to death row within the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Now, unfortunately, to this day, he is still sitting in death row. Executions in Texas Capitol can sometimes take really long time, years, if not even decades. And this is not uncommon. A lot of people who are sentenced to death row sometimes end up just staying there forever. And his conviction did trigger an automatic appeals process, but all of that is getting denied. This case, when it happened, drew widespread attention. And that was mostly due to the number of victims that were involved in this case and just the intense brutality of the crimes. And Jason's statements about his religious motivations, there was a lot of thoughts and comments about it during the trial and during this case. For all 5 victims, the Texas trial provided legal resolution, but it didn't erase the pain of the loss. Now, what did you guys think of this case? I know it was quite brutal and graphic, so please make sure you guys are taking care of yourselves. I would like to know what you guys think in the comment section down below. Feel free to share any thoughts that you might have. But thank you guys so much for watching today's video and for taking the time to learn about today's case. Feel free to leave a like, a subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys in the next one.